this isn't only a book about my love of reptiles and amphibians and about the natural history of these animals themselves. It's also the story of my childhood, of various events in my life, especially my relationship with my father. And I suppose partly I wanted to read this passage because I felt it was a moment in which I was explicitly making something clear about the nature of writing and the nature of memory, and the way that a memoir, although it's true to what happened, is also a kind of work of artistic composition. In bed that night, through the wall, I heard him moaning. He often did. There was an accelerating series of sounds, rising to a shout and a gasp. Then there was muttering. I heard my mother soothe him. There, love, there. For a time I thought these sounds were sex cries. But once, after they had been loud several times in the night, my mother said next morning, I expect you heard your father last night. He was dreaming they were shooting at him again. My father had been a tank gunner in France in the weeks after D-Day. He was 21. His leg had been wounded by shrapnel. One summer he had taken us to Normandy. The invasion beaches had museums. Photographs showed troops wading ashore, wounded soldiers in stretchers, tanks in the muddy lanes, earth showering as shells hit the ground. Real tanks were on display, and German beach defences. Tricolour, Stars and Stripes, and Union Jacks were everywhere, and D-Day bookshops. There were racks of postcards. All this was interesting to me. I knew D-Day from my comics, though the Battle of Britain fascinated me more. What Dad wanted, though, was to hunt down exact places, corners of fields. A name on a signpost caught his attention. Bully-les-Mines. We were pinned down for 3 days there. I never knew details of how he was wounded. My sister Anne said recently that something had been troubling her about this. He told me he was wounded during a brew, she said. That's all. He didn't say any more. And all this time I thought he meant that a shell landed while they were making a pot of tea. I had that image in my mind of Dad and the other men sitting on steps in a French town square drinking tea. His friend was killed next to him, and he got shrapnel in his leg. But now I wonder, they used the word brew for a battle, didn't they? Perhaps that's what he meant. I've had the wrong picture all this time. The village was ordinary, quiet. A church, a small cafe, men sitting outside. Beyond the village was a crossroads. Dad thought he remembered. Grassy verges, high hedges, wooden gate. It seemed featureless to me. I went with him into the field. In the corner was a rusty piece of farm machinery. Dad looked around. There were cowpats with flies running on them. He stood still. I spotted a ragged sheet of metal in the long grass near the farm machine and went over to lift it, hoping for a European fire salamander, shiny black and blotched with yellow, to me an almost mythical creature. In the yellow grass under the metal there was nothing. But I saw a movement on the gatepost. A brown wall lizard ran down it. Another scurried into the grass. I waited, and the smiling head emerged from a crack in the concrete, the base of the fence post. Around its lips there were black and white markings like checkers. Dad was standing in the middle of the field. "I think this is the place," he said, but he did not seem sure. The lizard, a male, ran halfway up the post and stopped, his tail quivering. A fly had settled a little further up. The lizard stared at it, head bobbing slightly, and then lunged, but the fly was gone. I half-watched this, and half-watched my father, turning his head this way and that. Somebody told me later, after the book had come out, that that word brew was specifically used for when a tank was hit with a shell and burst into flames and burnt up. That was called a brew. I didn't know that when I wrote this, but in a way the great thing about writing memoir, creative writing as compared to academic writing, is that your research is sufficient for the dramatic moment that you're trying to create. If you discover something later, that's okay. It doesn't mean you have to go back and change what you've already done, necessarily. You're commemorating the particular moment, the particular state of your knowledge at that time. And then that European fire salamander. Now, I say it here, it was an almost mythical creature to me, and that was because I'd seen pictures of them and really longed to catch one. They seemed such brilliant animals. But there is a well-known myth about the salamander. The myth about the salamander is that it can survive unharmed in the middle of a flame. It can emerge from the fire undamaged, still alive, uninjured. This can't be true. I mean, any amphibian, any animal, but any amphibian would be particularly vulnerable to fire. But, of course, when thinking about the war, thinking about these tanks being hit and bursting into flame, thinking about my father having come through that and survived the war, suddenly it seemed a perfect fit. Now, I didn't do that intentionally. I didn't put it there because I'd thought of that. I've only thought of that since. But that's the sort of thing that happens in writing when you really feel somehow it's working, somehow it's doing all sorts of things for you that you didn't know it was going to do.